The distress signal had been looping for years, lost in the endless void. When it finally pinged on their scanners, Captain Rourke knew it was worth investigating. The Erebus had been missing for nearly a decade, presumed destroyed. A ghost ship like that? It meant one thing: salvage. The Harbinger, their rusted but reliable hauler, drifted closer to the massive derelict. It loomed in the dark, barely reflecting the distant starlight. The hull was scarred, pockmarked with old battle damage, and the docking bay door hung open like a gaping mouth. No response from the ship's systems. No crew. Just silence. Rourke and his team, Ortega, Shaw, and Flynn, suited up. The moment their boots clamped onto the Erebus's deck, an uneasy feeling settled over them. The air inside was stale but breathable. The emergency lights flickered weakly, casting long, shifting shadows. "This place is dead," Shaw muttered, her voice crackling over comms. Ortega knelt by the nearest console, trying to pull up logs. Power's barely holding on. Life support's running, but not much else. The hallways stretched ahead, dark and silent, littered with debris. They found torn fabric, scattered tools, and deep gouges in the walls as if something had clawed through metal. But no bodies, no sign of what had happened. "Where's the crew?" Flynn asked, his voice tight with unease. No one had an answer. Deeper inside, the ship's bridge was a mess. Panels shattered, chairs overturned. The main display flickered weakly, a distorted loop of the distress signal still playing. Mayday, Mayday, Erebus, compromised, do not, repeat, do not, then static. Rourke exchanged a glance with Ortega. Whatever happened here, they knew it was bad. Shaw moved toward the command console, scanning for anything useful. Then, a noise. A faint, distant thud. They all froze. Another one. Closer this time. Something else was on this ship. The ship's air was thick with tension, each breath feeling heavier than the last. The crew pressed on, moving deeper into the Erebus as the flickering lights above them cast eerie, broken shadows across the corridor. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the occasional hum of failing systems and the distant thudding of their boots against the cold metal floor. Ortega was the first to find something interesting. In the command center, buried beneath the wreckage, he uncovered a data pad, half crushed but still functional. He brought it to Shaw, who quickly booted it up. "Let's see what the last crew was dealing with," she muttered. The screen blinked to life, showing fragmented logs. The entries were erratic, like the crew had been racing against time, their words frantic and disjointed. One entry stood out. "Something's inside the walls. It moves, fast. It's getting smarter. We can't stop it. It's learning. It's learning us." Shaw frowned. Paranoia. They were probably just terrified. This whole place is a wreck. Flynn wasn't convinced. Still, what the hell does inside the walls mean? Rourke stared down the dark corridor, scanning for anything out of the ordinary. "We're going to find out. Let's move." They made their way through the ship, sticking to the main pathways. The deeper they ventured, the stranger it felt, like the ship itself was holding its breath. And then it began. The skittering noises. At first, just a faint scratching, as though something small and quick was crawling through the ventilation ducts overhead, but soon it became unmistakable. Click, clack, click, clack. Flynn paused, his eyes darting around nervously. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, it's probably just the ship settling," Shaw said, trying to dismiss the growing unease in her chest. But then it came again, closer. The metallic scrape of claws against metal, rapid and relentless. It echoed down the corridors, reverberating in the bones of the ship. Ortega's hand moved instinctively toward his weapon, a faint tremor in his fingers. "We're not alone." "Stay sharp," Rourke ordered, his voice low. They continued down the hallway, each step louder in their ears than the last. As they approached a cross-section, Shaw swore she saw something move out of the corner of her eye, dark and swift, vanishing into a doorway before she could process it. "Did you see that?" she whispered, voice trembling. Rourke turned to look, his hand tight on the grip of his own gun. "See what?" But before Shaw could respond, Ortega stepped forward, his eyes locked on something in the dim light, a smear of blood along the floor leading into a maintenance hatch. "Guess we're going down there," Ortega said, nodding toward the hatch. They approached cautiously, the skittering noise now growing louder, almost frantic. "Wait," Flynn whispered, his eyes wide with fear. "There's something moving in the vents." The walls seemed to pulse, as if alive. It was no longer just paranoia. It was real. Shaw's voice barely rose above a whisper. "We need to get out of here, now." But it was too late. Something thudded heavily behind them, followed by a low, guttural sound that wasn't human. Something huge was moving, no, chasing them. With a burst of adrenaline, Rourke pushed the crew forward. They ran. But as they did, the shadow of something monstrous darted past the corridor, just out of view. Its eyes, two gleaming inhuman orbs, caught the light before disappearing into the darkness. The air aboard the Erebus felt heavier now, thick with dread. As they bolted through the dark corridors, Rourke made the call to split up. It was their only option. They needed to cover more ground, to figure out what the hell was stalking them before it picked them off one by one. "Ortega, Shaw, you two check the lower decks," Rourke ordered, his voice cold with resolve. "Flynn, you're with me. We'll head toward the reactor." The team moved quickly, each of them knowing that wasting any more time meant death. The ship's dark, twisted hallways seemed to stretch out endlessly, as though the very walls were shifting to disorient them. Carter, the newest member of the crew, volunteered to check the engineering sector alone. He had been quiet, eager to prove himself, but now Rourke felt a twinge of doubt. Carter's nervousness hadn't gone unnoticed. Still, the job needed doing. "Carter, stay in contact," Rourke reminded him over comms as the younger man set off down a side corridor. No response. "Carter," Rourke called again. The silence was thick, unnerving. "Damn it!" Rourke's heart sank as the minutes dragged on. He tried calling Carter a few more times. Nothing. The crew was on edge, but nobody said anything. They all knew the same thing. The longer they went without hearing from Carter, the worse it was. Eventually, they regrouped near the reactor control room. The lights flickered above them, casting a stuttering glow. Rourke was about to suggest they go after Carter when the comms crackled to life. "Rourke," Shaw said, her voice tight, "you need to see this." They followed her voice through the winding halls until they arrived at the engineering bay. It was a scene straight out of a nightmare. The door was half open, the heavy steel creaking like it was trying to resist the force that had entered. Inside, Carter's body was pinned against the wall. Ortega stepped back, a hand over his mouth as he stared at the sight. Carter's body was mangled, his limbs twisted at unnatural angles. His face, if you could still call it a face, was barely recognizable, torn open like something had shredded him from the inside out. His eyes, wide in terror, were fixed in an unblinking stare. But what made the scene truly horrific wasn't just the carnage. It was the distinct lack of blood. The body had been torn apart with surgical precision. Whatever had done this had been careful, almost deliberate. Flynn stepped closer, trembling. What the hell did this? Rourke felt the dread that had been growing inside him spread like a cancer. He didn't need to say it. They all knew. This wasn't some random attack. This was something intelligent, something that had learned how to hunt. It was watching them. "We need to get out," Shaw whispered, her voice unsteady. "No," Rourke said, his voice grim but firm. "We can't leave yet. If we're going to survive, we need to find out what the hell's going on here." As they stepped back, Ortega spotted something on the floor, a strange, deep gouge, like claws had scraped through the metal, leading out of the room and down another dark corridor. He followed it with his eyes, a shudder running down his spine. "I don't like this," Ortega muttered, but Rourke already knew. They couldn't turn back now. They had to keep moving. But as they moved to leave, a distant thud echoed from somewhere deep within the ship. The sound was heavy, deliberate, like something massive was walking or stalking closer. Panic started to take root, a primal fear that they couldn't shake. They were being hunted, and now they had a body to prove it. The Erebus felt like a tomb now, the silence more oppressive than ever. The air seemed to thicken with each breath they took, the weight of impending doom pressing down on them. Rourke gathered the crew in the central hub, their faces pale, eyes wild with panic. Carter's body was still a grotesque reminder of their own fragility. The realization had set in. The ship wasn't just abandoned, it was a trap, and whatever had killed Carter was still aboard, waiting. "We need to lock down sections of the ship, contain whatever's out there," Rourke said, his voice steady, though his heart raced. The others nodded, though the fear in their eyes was unmistakable. They split up, each member heading to key sections of the ship to seal off any access points. Shaw and Ortega headed toward the forward bulkhead, while Flynn stayed behind with Rourke to try and secure the reactor area. The ship's failing systems were a constant struggle. The lights flickered again, casting brief flashes of illumination before plunging them back into darkness. The control panels were unresponsive, slow to boot, as though the Erebus itself was refusing to cooperate. "Damn it!" Shaw cursed, slamming a fist against the control panel. "This is not going to hold." "We're running out of time," Ortega said, his voice strained. "We need to get these doors sealed, or we're all dead." But the doors wouldn't lock. The panels refused to respond, and a few doors simply didn't close at all, leaving gaping openings that led into the void beyond. The ship's power had long since been unstable, and the walls seemed to hum with an ominous energy. "We've got maybe 10 minutes before that thing finds us," Rourke said over comms. "We need to get this locked down now." Suddenly a sound, a low growl echoed from somewhere off to the left, heavy and guttural, like something was moving in the walls again. The crew froze. Then the unmistakable skittering returned, quick and frantic. "Ortega, Shaw, you two get to the aft bulkhead now," Rourke barked. "Flynn, stay with me. We're locking down here." But it was already too late. The ship's lights flared one last time before plunging them into total darkness. A shrill scream rang out over the comms. It was Shaw. Rourke's heart stopped. He turned toward Flynn, but Flynn's face had gone white. "Shaw, she's gone! She's gone, Rourke!" Flynn gasped. They heard it then, an eerie dragging sound, followed by a low, sickening thud. It was Shaw. Her scream had been cut short, and now they could hear the faintest sound of movement, something monstrous dragging her through the halls. "No!" Ortega's voice crackled through their comms, frantic and panicked. "Shaw's been taken. It took her. She's gone. Rourke, what the hell do we do now?" Rourke's mind raced. He couldn't think, couldn't breathe. This was no longer about salvaging tech or surviving a simple mission. They were trapped in a nightmare, and the nightmare was hunting them one by one. Rourke grabbed Flynn by the arm. "We've got to get to the escape pods, now." As they turned to move, they heard a terrifying sound from the hallway. Scraping, a clicking of claws against metal, coming closer. They weren't alone. They never had been. The door to the reactor room slammed shut with a violent bang, and the panel blinked to life, locking them inside. A surge of panic hit Rourke. The ship was locking them in, trapping them like prey. "Flynn, you got a way out?" Flynn shook his head, his face ghostly pale. "The escape pods they're on the other side of the ship. We'll never make it. Then we fight." The scraping sound grew louder, closer. Something was coming for them, and this time there was nowhere left to hide. The thick scent of decay hung in the air as Rourke and Flynn crept through the darkened corridors, their footsteps soft and cautious. They had heard the scraping noises from a distance, but the closer they got, the more they realized that something far worse than an alien predator was waiting for them. The ship's systems were failing, and the flickering emergency lights barely illuminated the path ahead. But what they found at the end of the trail of blood stopped them dead in their tracks. The walls of the lower decks had transformed. Where once there had been metal and wiring, there were now thick, pulsating organic growths. The surfaces of the ship were covered in jagged, fleshy tendrils that seemed to move with a life of their own. The growths thrummed softly, emitting a sickly greenish glow that bathed the entire area in an unnatural light. The ship, once a cold and mechanical hulk, had become something alive. "What the hell is this?" Flynn whispered, his voice trembling as he stared at the grotesque transformation. Rourke didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both knew what this was, a nest. They moved cautiously, weapons drawn, stepping around pools of dark, congealing blood. The air grew heavier, thicker, and Rourke's stomach churned. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up, as if the very air was charged with something malignant. At the end of the hallway, they found the entrance to a large, cavernous chamber. The door was partially open, the metal buckled and bent, and through the gap, they could hear low, unearthly sounds, groans, raspy breaths. Rourke shoved the door open, and what they saw inside was worse than anything they could have imagined. The room was a grotesque hive. Thick bulbous sacs hung from the ceiling, pulsating with each breath of the ship. The floor was slick with dark fluids, and the walls seemed to breathe with an unnatural rhythm. There, in the center of the chamber, were the bodies of the Erebus crew, cocooned in the fleshy walls, suspended in grotesque organic traps. Some were barely recognizable, their features distorted, their bodies in the early stages of assimilation. The cocooned bodies twitched, some still alive, their eyes wide with terror as they stared into the dark abyss of their captor's lair. Rourke's stomach twisted as he spotted one of the crew, half-formed, its mouth agape in a silent scream. The poor soul's limbs were elongated, the skin stretched tight over bones, as though the body had been altered by something outside of nature's design. It was no longer human, just a grotesque shell, waiting for whatever horrific fate had been decided for it. Then he saw something that froze his blood. One of the cocooned bodies, barely breathing, still had its eyes open. It was watching them. Flynn recoiled in horror, stumbling back as he saw the same thing. "Oh God, are they still alive?" Rourke's voice was barely a whisper. "Barely. It's turning them into hosts." The realization hit like a punch to the gut. They weren't just prey. They were potential hosts. The creature, or creatures, that had taken over the Erebus weren't just hunting for food. They were using the ship's crew to incubate their offspring. The bodies weren't dead. They were being reworked, transformed into something new. A low, wet growl echoed from the far end of the chamber. Rourke's eyes snapped to the shadows, his heart pounding in his chest. Something was coming, and it was ready to feed. He didn't think so. He acted. "Flynn, we need to move, now." They turned, running as fast as they could. The ship seemed to shift around them, the walls closing in. The scraping sounds of something large and fast filled the air behind them. But it wasn't just the creature chasing them anymore. The Erebus itself felt alive, hungry, pulsing, and eager to swallow them whole. As they reached the corridor, Rourke glanced over his shoulder. A shadow moved toward them, impossibly fast, its eyes gleaming with malice. "Run!" Rourke shouted, pushing Flynn ahead of him. They tore through the ship, their breath ragged, their hearts hammering in their chests. They couldn't outrun it, they knew that. But they had to try. There was only one way out. But getting to it, alive, was no longer guaranteed. The adrenaline was still pumping through Rourke's veins as they stumbled into the bridge, the dim emergency lights casting eerie shadows across the control panels. Flynn was barely holding it together, sweat pouring down his face as he gasped for air. They were running out of time, out of options. The creature was hunting them, its presence always just a few steps behind. But there was something else now, a thought gnawing at the back of Rourke's mind. He'd heard the whispers over comms earlier, the cryptic logs from the Erebus, the ship's final entries, desperate, frantic, panicked messages that hadn't made sense before. They were about something. Something inside the ship. "We need to find the ship's logs," Rourke said, turning to Flynn. "We need to know what happened." Flynn nodded, swallowing hard. He wasn't one for tech, but he knew enough to access the ship's main terminal. As he punched in commands, the screen flickered and came to life. The words on the screen were a blur of technical jargon until they finally found the entry they were looking for. It was an old log, corrupted, damaged, but it was enough. The Erebus was transporting an alien specimen in cryostasis, Rourke read aloud. His voice caught on the words. "A weaponized life form, bred for war." Flynn's eyes widened. "What the hell does that mean? A weapon?" Rourke continued reading, his breath growing shallow as he processed the details. It was kept in a specialized containment unit, isolated, in stasis. But the logs, they say it broke free. Flynn took a step back, his face pale. "No way. You're saying this thing is from the ship?" "Exactly. The creature we're dealing with, it's not just a mindless predator. It's intelligent. It learned how to escape." The more Rourke read, the more the truth became clear. The crew of the Erebus had been tasked with transporting the alien to an off-world military base. But something had gone wrong during transit. A malfunction. The creature had awoken early, before anyone knew what was happening. The logs were full of frantic entries as the crew tried to contain it, but they were no match. The creature was adaptive. It evolved quickly, learning from every mistake, every failed attempt to contain it. "Shit," Flynn muttered. "It was never just a creature. It was an experiment." Rourke nodded grimly. The creature wasn't just hunting for survival. It was testing them, learning their weaknesses. It was no longer a mindless monster. It had become a predator in every sense of the word. And now it was hunting them with terrifying intelligence. "We need to find a way to trap it," Rourke said. "It's too smart for us to just outrun. We're running out of places to hide." The ship's systems had taken on a new, nightmarish quality. Every hallway felt like it was closing in on them. The ship itself seemed to be working in tandem with the creature, guiding it toward them, funneling them into its traps. It was no longer just the Erebus's malfunctioning systems. It was alive. "There has to be something in the logs, something we missed," Rourke continued, scanning the screen. "A weakness, anything we can use against it." The next entry was another technical readout, but one sentence stood out. "The creature adapts rapidly. It has learned how to mimic human behavior." Rourke froze. "Mimic human behavior?" Flynn's voice was low, filled with dread. "You don't mean it can disguise itself?" Rourke didn't need to answer. He had already seen it, had already suspected it. The thing had been learning. It wasn't just hunting. It was trying to become them, to infiltrate their ranks. If it could mimic their movements, their actions, it would become unstoppable. "You think it could be anyone?" Flynn asked, his eyes darting around nervously. Rourke's hand instinctively went to his sidearm. "I don't know, but I'm not taking any chances." As if on cue, the door to the bridge slammed open, and a loud, echoing clank reverberated down the hallway. The scraping sound was louder now, closer. The creature was coming. Rourke grabbed Flynn's arm. "We need to move, now." They bolted for the exit, but before they could make it, the lights flickered once more, and a low growl echoed from the shadows. The creature was already there, moving through the dark like a shadow, its eyes glowing with a malevolent intelligence. It wasn't just hunting them anymore, it was hunting them. The ship was growing darker, The emergency lights cast long, haunting shadows as the survivors huddled in the cramped command room, their breaths shallow and hearts racing. Their numbers were dwindling, each loss more painful than the last. Carter, Flynn, and Rourke were the only ones left. The others were gone, consumed, dragged into the depths of the ship, their screams still echoing in the dark corners of Rourke's mind. But they weren't out of options yet. "We still have one shot," Rourke said, his voice hoarse, barely a whisper over the comms. The desperation in his tone was palpable. "We need to reach the reactor. If we can overload it, make it go critical, we can take out the nest, destroy everything." Flynn nodded, a grim look on his face. He'd never been the kind of man who gave up easily, but now, with so few left, the weight of it all was suffocating. "It's risky," he said, running a hand through his matted hair. "The ship's already on its last legs, but it's our only chance." "We don't have time," Rourke insisted. "Every minute we wait, the creature learns more. We'll be dead by the time we figure anything else out. We overload the reactor, we destroy the nest. It's our only shot." They had no illusions about the plan's odds of success. The Erebus was falling apart around them, and the reactor, a massive unstable core at the heart of the ship, was their best and only hope. They'd have to fight their way through the dark, deep into the bowels of the ship, risking everything for a chance at survival. "Let's move," Rourke ordered. They made their way through the ship, quiet but quick, sticking to the darkened corridors where the creature wouldn't be able to track them as easily. But even as they moved, something felt off. Every step they took seemed to echo through the ship. Every shadow seemed to hold something just out of sight. It wasn't just the ship that was watching them. The creatures, they weren't mindless beasts anymore. They were calculating, methodical. Each of the remaining crew members could feel it. Every turn, every corner was being watched. They weren't just hunting. They were studying. The aliens had learned. The silence was shattered by a sharp, wet hiss. Flynn jerked his head to the side, but it was already too late. A shadow darted out from a nearby vent, its claws scraping along the metal as it descended toward them. Flynn's eyes widened in terror as the creature, no longer just an alien, but something far more cunning, lunged. "Flynn!" Rourke shouted. Before he could react, Flynn was grabbed, yanked backward into the darkness. His scream was cut off abruptly, and Rourke could do nothing but stand frozen in place, his heart hammering in his chest. "What the hell?" Carter gasped, pulling his weapon and pointing it into the darkness. "Flynn! Flynn!" Rourke's mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The creature had waited. It had known. It had anticipated their movements. And now Flynn was gone. "We can't stay here," Rourke said, his voice shaking. "We can't afford to waste any more time. We need to finish this. Now." They had already lost too much. Now there was nothing left but to finish what they started. The two of them moved quickly through the ship, but the sense of dread was growing stronger with each step. The corridors felt narrower, the air thicker. It was as if the ship itself was closing in on them. They were being herded, guided toward the heart of the ship, where the reactor was located. When they finally reached the reactor's main control room, it was as if they had been led into a trap. The air was too still. The lights flickered ominously. It was too quiet. They stepped inside cautiously. The reactor core loomed before them, a massive, unstable structure designed to power the entire ship. But even as they approached, something wasn't right. The doors slammed shut behind them, trapping them inside. Rourke's heart skipped a beat. He knew what had happened. The ship had been guiding them here, leading them into a final confrontation. But the creatures weren't just hunting them. They were controlling the situation. As they prepared to overload the reactor, the floor beneath them trembled. A deafening screech echoed from the vents. The creature, no, they, were close. The last thing Rourke heard was Carter's voice, low and strained, as the room began to shake. "Get ready, Rourke. It's now or never." And then, the door to the reactor room burst open. The doors to the reactor room exploded open, and Rourke's heart stopped. It wasn't just one of them. It was a swarm, dozens of the creatures, more than he had ever seen in one place, rushing toward them with unnerving speed. The lights flickered again, the emergency sirens blaring through the ship's intercom. The Erebus was fighting them now, its systems failing, its pulse a cacophony of malfunctioning alarms and flashing lights. "Move! Move!" Rourke shouted, grabbing Carter's arm and pulling him toward the reactor's control panel. The room seemed to close in around them. The walls pulsed with a low, throbbing hum, the ship's heartbeat, or perhaps something darker. They didn't have much time. Carter fumbled with the control panel, his fingers shaking, sweat dripping down his forehead. "The system's unstable. I need more time to overload it." "They're coming!" Rourke yelled, turning to see the creatures closing in on them, their eyes glowing with an eerie, predatory hunger. Every footstep they took seemed to echo louder in Rourke's mind, each of them an ominous reminder of how quickly they were losing control. But it wasn't just the creatures. It was the ship itself. The walls around them groaned, metal screeching as the internal systems went haywire. Panels sparked, and the lights flickered once more, leaving them in total darkness for brief, heart-stopping moments before the emergency lights blinked back to life. "Just a little longer," Carter pleaded, his voice strained. He worked feverishly, but the pressure was mounting. The creatures were close, so close that Rourke could hear the wet, squelching sound of their claws dragging across the floor, and then the unmistakable hiss that had haunted them since the moment they boarded the Erebus. The air grew thick, heavy with the scent of something alien, something far worse than the creatures themselves. It wasn't just the hunting pack anymore. From the darkness ahead, a figure emerged, taller than the others, larger, more powerful. Rourke's breath caught in his throat. The Queen. It was massive, far more grotesque than the smaller creatures. Its body was a writhing mass of alien limbs, its skin a sickly gray that seemed to shimmer with a fluid-like sheen. Its eyes were milky white, its mouth an endless void of sharp, jagged teeth. The Queen didn't move like the others. It was a force, an apex predator, an intelligence that guided the others with ruthless precision. It had been the true mastermind behind the hunt all along. "Carter!" Rourke shouted, panic creeping into his voice. "Hurry! It's here!" Carter's hands were a blur of motion as he typed furiously at the console, the sweat on his brow mingling with the grime of their desperate struggle. The Queen hissed, her long limbs creeping closer, moving with unsettling grace. The smaller creatures, the soldiers, stood ready, a silent, violent army at her command. But Rourke couldn't tear his eyes away from the Queen. She was the key to their survival. If they didn't take her down, they wouldn't make it out alive. "Carter, we don't have time," Rourke barked, pulling his weapon free, his eyes locked on the Queen. His mind was racing. If they didn't act fast, they were dead. Carter looked up at him, his face pale. I need a minute. It's almost there." Rourke didn't wait. He fired. The blast rang out through the confined space of the reactor room, striking the Queen's massive form. But the Queen didn't flinch. Instead, it screeched, an ear-splitting, high-pitched sound that rattled the walls of the ship. The smaller creatures responded in kind, charging forward with a renewed frenzy. "Keep firing!" Rourke ordered, his own gun blazing as he laid down a barrage of shots. But the Queen's thick hide absorbed the rounds, only angering it further. The air around them seemed to vibrate with the Queen's fury, the sound of her screeches rattling the very walls of the Erebus. The creature's long, spindly limbs lashed out, smashing against the walls, sending sparks flying from the ship's failing systems. The ship was fighting them in every way it could. "Carter!" Rourke shouted again. "We need that overload now." Carter's hands were shaking violently, but he kept working, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps. "Almost there. Almost—" A sudden, bone-chilling screech made them both freeze. The Queen had advanced, her massive form barreling toward them with terrifying speed. Her claws swiped at Rourke, missing by inches, but the force of her movement sent him flying back, crashing into the reactor's control panel. His vision blurred as pain radiated through his chest. "Rourke!" Carter shouted, his voice cracking with fear. "Get up! We're almost—" But before Carter could finish, the Queen lunged. In that split second, everything seemed to slow down. Rourke scrambled to his feet, but the Queen's claws were faster, swiping toward him with deadly precision. The ship's systems flickered, the lights dimming again as if the very heart of the Erebus was dying. Then, just as Rourke braced for the end, the entire ship trembled and a loud bang rang out. The reactor systems had come online. The lights flared brilliantly as the core ignited. The overload sequence had begun. "No!" the Queen screeched, but it was too late. A sudden wave of heat washed over them as the reactor core began to overheat, the countdown to detonation starting. The Queen and her swarm paused, the briefest hesitation flickering in their alien minds as the realization of what was happening hit them. The survivors had one chance. "Run!" Rourke screamed, grabbing Carter by the arm and yanking him away from the core. They turned and bolted for the door, their only hope now the shrinking chance that the overload would be enough to destroy the hive. They ran, feet pounding against the metal floors, the ship vibrating under the growing pressure. The Queen roared, her body writhing in fury. But the survivors couldn't stop now. The countdown was their final ally. And just as the explosion roared through the Erebus, swallowing everything in its path, the two men were hurled into darkness. The explosion rocked the ship with deafening force. Rourke and Carter were thrown off their feet, crashing into the steel floor of the corridor. The air was thick with smoke, the acrid scent of burning metal and ozone filling their lungs. They scrambled to their feet, eyes bloodshot from the shockwave, ears ringing with the aftermath. The Erebus was dying. The once mighty vessel, a symbol of advanced technology, now creaked and groaned as it buckled under the weight of its own destruction. The core was unstable, its countdown to total collapse ticking away like a clock of doom. Rourke could hear the ship's dying breaths, flashes of red lights, loud mechanical whines, and the crackling of burning wires. But they couldn't stop now. They had to make it to the escape pods. "Carter, let's move!" Rourke barked, his voice strained as he grabbed the younger man by the arm and pulled him forward. They didn't get far. The aliens, those things, had already adapted to the reactor overload. They were swarming in faster than ever before, their grotesque forms scuttling through the shadows. Their eyes gleamed with rage, their claws clanging against the metal floor as they hunted, their movements more aggressive and frantic than before. The hive was collapsing, but they weren't going down without a fight. "We need to get to the pods, now!" Carter yelled, his voice panicked, his eyes darting around. They had to make it. There was no other way. But the path to the escape pods was blocked. Rourke's heart sank as he saw them. Dozens of the alien soldiers pouring down the hall in a frenzied rush. Their screeches were deafening, sending a ripple of dread through his chest. The Queen's roar had triggered something in them, a desperate need to survive, even if it meant fighting to the death. "Go!" Rourke shouted, shoving Carter toward the hallway. But even as he did, he realized there was no way they were both getting out. "Rourke!" Carter cried, but Rourke was already moving toward the oncoming swarm. He knew what had to be done. "Carter, go!" Rourke ordered, pulling out his gun and firing into the mass of approaching aliens. The rounds tore through the first few, but there were too many. They didn't stop coming. They never stopped coming. Carter hesitated, fear written on his face, but Rourke's voice broke through. "Go! You're the last one. You need to survive. Tell them what happened." There was a moment of silence, just a heartbeat. Then Carter nodded, the grim reality of it hitting him full force. He turned and bolted down the hall, leaving Rourke behind, but Rourke didn't turn away. He planted himself firmly in place, firing his weapon again and again, slowing the alien's advance. But it wasn't enough. The swarm closed in, faster now, their screeches ringing in his ears, their bodies pressing against him. There was no time. He glanced over his shoulder once, his eyes locking with Carter's retreating form, a silent exchange between them. "I'm sorry." Then, with no more hesitation, Rourke pulled the emergency detonation cord at his waist. A red light flashed on his wrist. The emergency explosive was set. He was buying Carter time. "Come on!" Rourke gritted his teeth, stepping back as the alien surged forward. He fired one last shot, right into the first creature's face, the shot echoing in the chaos. The blast sent the creature stumbling, but it didn't stop. It kept coming. They all kept coming. Rourke stepped backward into the center of the hallway, still firing, still trying to hold them off. His legs were heavy, his movements slower now, but he wouldn't give up. Not until he knew Carter was safe. And then, with a final scream, Rourke dove toward the detonator button. The alien surged forward, but Rourke's hand slammed into the panel just as they reached him. He had no time to flinch as the explosion erupted, engulfing the hallway in a blinding flash. The force of the blast knocked him off his feet, and for a moment, everything went black. When he came to, the Erebus was shaking violently beneath him, the ship groaning as it collapsed in on itself. The detonation had triggered a chain reaction, explosions rippling through the structure. The corridors were now burning wreckage, twisted metal and flaming debris blocking his path to escape. He could hear the sounds of the creatures still screeching, but they were farther away now. The ship was tearing itself apart. Through the fire and smoke, Rourke stumbled to his feet. His body was bruised, bloodied, but he had to keep moving. He wasn't sure how much time he had left. The reactor was still unstable, the countdown still ticking. He knew Carter was gone. He knew that he couldn't save anyone else now. The only chance they had left was for Rourke to escape. But could he even make it? The ship was collapsing faster than he could move. The escape pods were just ahead, but the corridors were filled with debris, the walls caving in from the force of the explosions. He could hear the creatures approaching once more. Their hisses were louder than ever, but then, as he turned a corner, a faint flickering light in the distance caught his eye. The escape pod. Rourke's pulse quickened. It was his only chance. The final chance. But he could hear the aliens moving closer. The ship was falling apart. Escape seemed impossible. The door to the pod was open, just as the swarm reached him. Rourke didn't hesitate. He sprinted, dodging the incoming creatures, his heart pounding in his chest. Every instinct in his body screamed to run faster. With every step, the weight of his sacrifice, his comrades, Carter, everything, pushed him forward. He dove into the escape pod. The door slammed shut behind him. He was alone. The ship's final moments came with a violent tremor. The escape pod shot into the cold void of space as the Erebus collapsed, its final scream echoing across the stars. Rourke's hands trembled as he gripped the controls of the escape pod. His breath came in ragged gasps, the aftershocks of the explosion still rattling his bones. He had made it. He had made it. But at what cost? The Erebus was a distant fiery glow now, erupting into a massive fireball that cast an eerie light across the void. The ship's death was final. The deep silence of space enveloped him, broken only by the faint hiss of the pod's failing life support system. His escape pod drifted, propelled only by the momentum of the explosion, toward the small salvage ship that had sent the distress signal to the Erebus. The rendezvous was shaky. He barely had the energy to steer the pod toward it. His body ached, his head pounding, but the small glimmer of hope that he might make it out alive kept him moving. His escape was barely a win. He had lost his crew, his friends, his humanity in that hellhole. He would never be the same. The docking bay of the salvage ship loomed ahead, and Rourke's exhausted body reacted mechanically. He guided the pod toward the airlock. He didn't know who would greet him, or if anyone would even be there. Would he be alone forever, wandering through space with nothing but the memories of the Erebus? A low, mechanical whine filled the air as the docking doors opened. He didn't wait to be greeted. He just staggered out of the pod, barely able to stand. His hands gripped the edge of the threshold, pulling himself out, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had lost. There was no one waiting for him on the other side. The ship, it seemed, was silent. "Hello?" Rourke's voice was hoarse, but it echoed in the empty halls. No response. He limped down the passageways, his mind blank, his only thoughts swirling around the images of the Erebus, the crew, Carter, the aliens, the blood. He could still feel their eyes on him. As he made his way through the ship, his movements mechanical, he couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something was wrong. The silence pressed on him like a weight. It wasn't right. He could feel it in his bones. Something about the atmosphere had shifted. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. But there was nothing. And then the console flashed. Rourke froze. His eyes locked onto the small, blinking light on the ship's command panel. It was faint, almost imperceptible. But it was there. A rhythmic signal. His breath caught in his throat as the cold realization hit him. No. It can't be. He moved forward, fingers numb as they hovered over the console. He punched a few commands in, forcing the ship to display the source of the signal. It was faint, intermittent, as if it were struggling to survive. It was coming from inside the ship. His pulse quickened. The signal was unmistakable. It was alien, distinct in its frequency, too irregular for any human technology to produce. The same type of signal they had picked up from the Erebus before they boarded. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the implications. No, Rourke muttered under his breath, his mind spinning, his fingers hovering over the buttons. He couldn't be hearing this. It had to be a malfunction. But no. He knew better now. There was something on the ship. He ran, his boots pounding against the cold metal floor, heart racing. The signal was growing stronger, more constant. And now it wasn't just in the walls, it was everywhere. The very air felt charged, heavy, as if something had crawled inside the ship and was biding its time, waiting. The sound of something moving in the vents made Rourke freeze mid-step. His breath hitched, and he slowly turned his head to the ceiling. The whirring noise was unmistakable. Something was up there. Something was inside. He was no longer alone. His footsteps echoed in the quiet corridors as he made his way back to the central control room. He knew the ship wasn't safe. The aliens, the creatures, they were survivors too. The Erebus had been just the beginning. Rourke knew what he had to do. He couldn't let this go on, but with every passing second, the truth settled in. The Erebus was never meant to be the last of them. The creatures, whatever they were, had followed him. The pod had been a mistake. They were never alone. He would never be free. He would never escape. He staggered toward the weapons locker, pulling it open with a deep breath. He wasn't just fighting to survive anymore. He was fighting to end it. The survivors of the Erebus had left a legacy behind, and it was coming for him now. But he was ready. As the rhythmic signal pulsed in the background, Rourke armed himself for a fight that would last until the last breath. The game had changed. The Erebus was gone, but its nightmare was just beginning.